This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this episode of the podcast. This episode is sponsored by gardencourses.com. Gardencourses.com offers online horticultural training for those looking to develop their own home gardens. The latest course to be added is Create Your Garden Sanctuary. You can go to gardencourses.com to find out more. This week I'm speaking to Mark Laurence. For decades, Mark has been at the vanguard of sustainable and ecologically sensitive landscape and garden design. He currently specialises in coastal plants and gardens, and in this interview we cover what makes a coastal garden, which types of plants fare well by the coast, and whether these gardens can be havens for wildlife. Mark starts by talking about a career that has often seen him at the forefront of the sustainability movement.
I've been in the landscape trade since the late 70s. So I started off working for an aquatic landscaper, a guy called Anthony Archer-Wills, who in his day was quite well known. Very eccentric guy. He was the first person to use butyl liners to make ponds and things. So quite forward thinking. And I developed a love of landscape. This is when I was 19, working for him. Learned all about the art of placing rocks and aquatics and nursery work. So a wide range of stuff. And that was my introduction to horticulture. From a casual job, it became a lifelong obsession, really. I went on from that to, pretty much immediately after that, I started working for myself and accumulating equipment and got more and more interested in trees. Ended up working with some really good tree surgeons who taught me how to climb and use chainsaws safely and so on. So I became an arborist for a number of years and did some really interesting sort of projects doing that. And then seesaw between arboriculture, landscape, managing firms for people. And then in the mid-80s, or slightly, 87 I think it was actually, set up as a landscape designer. And in those days, there weren't that many of us around. So I just put a little advert out in the back of the RHS magazine and started work. So it's all been very informal, build up a very hands-on learning experience. So, you know, as a route for me, other than it's not being college-based or academic or anything. So I just learnt everything on the job, as it were, over the years, and it probably couldn't get away with that these days. But
Oh, I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's how I worked, and for me, it suited me. And by the time I wanted to go and do an arboricultural training course, I was so busy. I was employing trained climbers instead. So, you know, for example, so I never got back into the college. So it helped, I think, that my father was a landscape architect and interior designer, and my mother was an artist. So I got a natural ability to draw. So that kind of pulled me over to the design side. I've got naturally a design-led mind, I just went through it, always very sustainably based, very much dealing with sort of ecological aspects. Wouldn't use weed killers or, you know, it was organic. So I was doing sustainability stuff before anyone was even really using the word in terms of landscape work. And that led me to, in early 2000s, 2005, 6 or something, I got contacted by London School of Economics, who wanted a sustainability feasibility study for their London site, and they couldn't find anyone who was talking sustainability apart from me. And that led me on into looking at urban greening. And from urban greening, I got really obsessed with the idea of living walls. So in 2007, I set up a living wall company with a business partner, and that company was Biotecture, who are still going and are very successful. And we developed our own, patented living wall system using hydroponics, and I worked through that company out in Chicago, Dubai, in parts of Europe. And that was really getting into the sort of urban green side and the green infrastructure and looking at how to put greenery into urban spaces other than in gardens. And wanted to sort of do something that was addressing bigger issues of, air quality, urban heat islands, all these sorts of, building insulation, all these sorts of ecological aspects of, green infrastructure. I left architecture and resumed work on my own. I was always still myself as a consultant, as Mark Laurence Design, but that was very much on the back burner. And then I set up another living wall company on my own called Vitology, because I just, being a stubborn sort of bloke, I like to do things my own way. And, so around Vitology is now, after 7 years, and doing some quite interesting projects, again, working abroad. My last living wall went up in Iceland, in Reykjavik. Now it got to the point where the market for living walls is really big, professional, very competitive on price. And I was just a small guy and wanted to get back to something more intimate and more connected with plants. So living down on the coast here, I've always done coastal gardens because, that's what's here. And we're on the coastal plain. And I absolutely love them. So I started growing plants. We have a greenhouse, which is legacy from our green wall days. I have an acre of glass, and we started growing plants. And this year we focused that down. I mean, obviously we got hit, like everybody, with COVID, and it was in a transition phase anyway for us. So that made it, that also forced a big rethink. And so we've come out of that, and we're now developing a really interesting range of plants, some native, some exotic, some for gardens, some for coastal sort of, vegetated shingles or sand dune plants. And of course I'm designing as well, gardens, but I only take on a few gardens at a time because the nursery at the moment is consuming most of my time. So it's all focused right now down onto the coast and the plants that grow by the sea.
It might sound like a bit of a daft question, but what is a coastal garden? I mean, how far can you be from the sea and still be classified as being a coastal garden?
Well, it's a good question. And I don't think there are any hard and fast rules about this. I haven't seen any classification of it, but I look at that a coastal garden is any garden whose climate is influenced by the sea. So, the coast where I am down in Sussex, we're on the coastal plains, so south of the Downs is very flat. It's all alluvial deposits from from erosion and from rivers. So it's very flat land. I think where we are, we're maybe 18 meters or something above sea level. So although we personally are 5 miles or so away from the sea, it's still you get the winds coming across from the sea. They're not intensively salt laden where we are, whereas of course they are on the coast. But so I tend to break it down into different zones, and I say coastal regions are any garden that is affected by the sea, who's got a more moderate climate because of the sea. Maybe it's milder, maybe it's wetter, maybe it's sunnier or drier. It could be any of those things that are moderated by its sort of coastal general location. Anything that's right on the seafront or the shorefront, I tend to call a beach garden, although of course they're not all on beaches. So a shorefront garden is something different again, and that is a garden that has the full impact of the sea and has to deal very directly with very strong, very salt laden winds and all the conditions that go with that. eventually, when we've got the nursery really sorted, we'll group our plants by zones, so that we'll have sort of vegetated shingle beach zones or sand dune plant type zones, and then you'll go into more general coastal plantings, shelter belt trees and things. So there's so many different ways of breaking it up. But I try to keep it simple. Really, I think it's better if you keep it simple. So coastal is general influence. Beach or shoreline is direct influence, if you like.
Mm. So obviously you've got lots of different conditions in terms of where the roots are going. You mentioned the salt-laden winds. Is that the main challenge for plants that are in a coastal garden?
Yeah, I think the salt. I mean, anywhere can be windy, but if you're windy up on moorlands, you're not going to have. You've got the wind to deal with, but you're not going to have salt laden unless it's moorland that's very close to the sea, of course. But by and large, the primary thing is salt burn, salt tolerance. Some of the plants we grow, might be halophytes. That's plants that are growing sort of salt saturated soils, such as you'd get on mud flats and estuaries and things. But most of the plants will have to tolerate a level of salt on their foliage. And a lot of the more ornamental plants will be the sort of more Mediterranean things that are used to growing, in sort of rocky hillsides and things around the Mediterranean areas of the world. And the Mediterranean, of course, is a zone. It's not just a place. So there are, 5 different zones around the world that are Mediterranean, not just the Mediterranean basin. But salt is, it can, the closer you get to the sea, the more dominant the salt factor is on what plants will survive.
And is there a rule of thumb in terms of what plants do well? Obviously, you mentioned the Mediterranean ones. Or is there, could you sort of be a bit more general and say, actually, we know this group of plants won't work there?
Well, it's not always automatically Mediterranean for a start. For example, there are sections of the coast along here which are on very heavy clay and get very waterlogged right on the shorefront. So I've worked on gardens where they're on a heavy clay and then they've got a shingle bank in front of them and the other side is the beach. And yet they are heavy waterlogged soils in the winter and water will tend to accumulate in them. So, if you put your standard Mediterranean shrubs into that sort of soil, they're not going to survive because the more classic Mediterranean plants are generally growing in pretty free draining conditions. So the conditions do vary. And of course, there are huge swathes of coast around the world which are not in Mediterranean zones, and they all have their own plants that are adapted to that environment. So, the range of plants are generally, I suppose they're generally less frost tolerant because you get less frosts, of course, on the coastal zones. That's not true everywhere. Again, obviously, many areas of coast can get bitterly cold, but for down in the south of the UK, you're not having to deal with heavy frosts in the sort of coastal regions. So that can mean that you can grow plants that you wouldn't tolerate. We go north of the downs from here. We got the coastal strip, and then we've got the chalk downs, and then the other side you're into the Weald, which is clay and green sand and things. And of course, you can get much heavier frost just 10 miles inland from here, which some of the coastal plants wouldn't cope with. So yes, there are definitely plants. There are more plants that you can grow here that you can't grow inland, I suppose, than the other way around. Yeah.
That's interesting, because you kind of assume they'd be quite harsh conditions. But I was wondering as well, if you were, for example, doing a beachfront garden, would you tend to use more plants that occur naturally in that area rather than ornamentals, or does that not necessarily follow that they'll be tougher?
I like, I definitely look at that, because I look at the wider context, and I would marry in many of the local native beach plants, but that doesn't mean I wouldn't mix ornamentals in with it. But you would zone it. So, if the garden was going straight down onto a beach, and if it was a pebble beach, you could use plants that are used to vegetated shingles on the, like sea kale or, that sort of thing, CP. There's all sorts of different things that will grow, but you can also mix natives in with that as well. And I'll give you a good example of that is, we have an area, we have Pagham Harbour down near us, and that's a sort of, an SSFI, and it's a very beautiful place, and it's got a strip of vegetated shingle beach, but it's got houses, lots of little chalet houses that people live in and that have been there since I don't know when, and they front straight onto the shingle beach. So in that area around there is this whole mix of garden escape plants and natives, and it's absolutely fantastic. It's like a dream. I love it, especially at this time of year when everything's in flower. And you walk down there and you see all the sort of vegetated shingle natives mingled with garden escapes that are growing very happily out there. You get curry plants and all sorts of things that are seeded out into the shingle from gardens and have naturalised there. So I'm supplying, or I'm discussing a municipal project for a council where they're putting in developing vegetated shingle areas and beach front, and they want to keep all the planting very native, and they don't want to mix in non-natives. But I think I can understand that approach, and that's the traditional approach. But I think with climate change, one of the most interesting factors is that beach gardens are the vanguard, if you like, of climate change, and that they're having to deal with some of the most extreme changes of weather and rising sea levels and all the things we see happening. And I think we need to adapt our planting to what will grow. I don't believe there's such a thing as native. There's just whatever happens to be in a region at any one point in time. So I think there's a huge scope for being adaptive in our planting in gardens and looking at the same time you have to have a bit of an eye on not putting in things that are really aggressively invasive. But there's plenty of things that naturalise and appear to be pretty beneficial to the wildlife and environment by doing so.
So can coastal gardens be rich in wildlife? I mean, you kind of think that they tend to be quite extreme environments and they may not be so hospitable to things like insects, but is that a misconception?
I think so. I was walking down on the same beach I've been mentioning recently, and there was Viper's bug loss in flower, smolodin bees. There's the Centranthus in flower again. And all these things. I mean, they wouldn't be there flowering if they didn't get pollinated. They're very rich areas, and of course, where you've got sand, you've got the potential for the kind of solitary bees that sort of burrow into sand as habitat. I think they're extremely rich environments. And the thing with climates and zones is wherever you get the overlap of different zones, you get an increase in biodiversity because you get some things from one zone overlapping with some things from another zone. And of course, the biggest contrast you could imagine is between land and sea in that respect.
I wondered if, I think for me, I always think trees struggle in a coastal garden, probably of all the plants. Do you have any kind of trees that you like to use over and again because they're such good survivors? I wondered if maybe you could just give one or two examples.
Well, yeah, trees are tricky. It depends on the context of the garden, of course. And with trees, it's kind of long term. So again, these days we have to think about climate adaptation. So if there's a reasonable size where you can plant trees that will get to any kind of maturity, and of course on a coast you're not going to, if you're right on the seafront, you're not going to get trees growing to the sort of sizes that they grow inland because the wind sees to that. So they're going to grow to a more stunted size. But one of my favourite sort of southern invaders from the Mediterranean is Quercus ilex, holm oak, which has naturalised. It's been planted for years along the coast, but is in places as naturalised. And that's a plant that is going to probably adapt pretty well to future conditions. Of course, we've got standards like Populus alba and Populus tremula. Quaking aspen is pretty good on the coast. There's all the Mediterranean pines, Pinus nigra, Pinea radiata. Olives, of course, olive trees. Tamarisk is another one, which is debatable whether you call it a tree or a shrub. But again, Tamarisk gallica is naturalised in parts of the south and southwest. So what else? I mean, there's obviously there's arbutus, really good. There's some acacias, Acacia delibata, and the plant I'm playing with at the moment is eucalyptus. A lot of eucalyptus are coastal in their origins, not all of them, and a lot of them are also very good at being coppiced. So by coppiced, I mean obviously pruned down to the ground every few years. So they'll take hard pruning, and I certainly wouldn't put eucalyptus into a garden on the beach and not prune it, because they are quite vulnerable to, some of them are quite vulnerable to wind throw. But if you prune them, they're down to the ground every 5 or 10 years or whatever, then you get amazing multi-stemmed trees, very coastal tolerant. So we're playing with some of those, and Gleditsia possibly is another one. But to be honest, there's a whole range of trees I think that I myself have yet to explore and want to grow. I mean, you get your native willows and things that grow down onto the sea, and even birch, although I don't think birch on the seafront and full exposure do very well, though you do see them. And Sorbus intermedia is another one.
Yeah, so you've got quite a wide choice, really. Yeah. I mean, I think sometimes it's difficult. Obviously, people can go and visit many beautiful gardens that are further inland. Can you think of a really well-designed, good example of a coastal garden that people might be able to visit? I mean, I don't know whether that would be, in the southeast or anywhere in England would be fine.
Well, it's funny. I don't spend a lot of time going around other gardens, and maybe, I think I should, but I always seem to be too busy. But I suppose that the most iconic beach garden, of course, is Derek Jarman's, and that's a garden that probably kicked it off as the idea that you can garden in the most extreme of environments. I believe Beth Chatto was influenced a lot by him. So that is a very classic garden. Now I'm going to struggle.
I know, it's hard, isn't it? Yeah.
I don't really visit them. I mean, what I do is when I go to coastal areas, I always just go to the coast and look at what's growing. And you see lots of amazing gardens, but I don't tend to walk around public gardens. It's an interesting one. Yeah. I'm probably not going to be much use on that one.
No, it's fine. I mean, like I say, I have found a dearth of information about these things. And kind of in a similar vein, Can you recommend any websites or books where people could find out more?
No. There's fractions of information everywhere, but I've not found a good definitive book that works for the UK. There's a few publications. I'm just trying to think of some. But again, I find when I'm looking for information, there is a dearth of it. There's not a go-to reference book or website or anything.
No. So you need to write one, and then in the meantime, people need to follow you on social media and watch what you're doing and visit your nursery, obviously.
Yeah, that's it. I will say my nursery is trade only. Okay.
Okay, good to know.
It's for designers and landscapers, and it's for jobs that are specified. I don't have the size or the scope or the resources to be public. I don't think I've got the energy either, to be honest.
Yeah.
So we're a nursery primarily for other designers and people in the trades, or for municipalities, or So again, just to mention that project in Essex, I'm working both with a municipality and with a civil engineering company who are doing the shorefront works. So those are my kind of clients.
Okay. Well, cool. I mean, I've come to the end of my questions. Is there anything else that you wanted to mention before I let you go?
I would put a call out to the designers and professionals that I've mentioned to contact me and let me know what it is that they want, because we're right at this early stage of putting together the plants that we supply, and I'm always really interested to talk to people and see where the gaps are. I think it's a fantastic sort of and very exciting sort of area that we're delving into. I think and it's got a lot of scope. Just really interested to hear from people.
Thank you, Mark. If you'd like to get in touch with Mark, you can find his details in the show notes. Thank you for listening. If you have come across any good resources for those growing in a coastal location, please do let me know. Thanks as well to gardencourses.com for sponsoring this episode. And just when I thought we'd busted the myth that worms couldn't reproduce from body parts, here's Dr. Bedford talking about one that can.
Living within dark, damp environments, such as leaf litter and under logs or plant pots, are a rather unique group of invertebrates that belong to a taxonomic phylum called the platyhelminths. Platyhelminths are more commonly known to us as flatworms, and can easily be recognised by their elongated, mucus-covered bodies, which are completely smooth and have no appendages or tentacles. They also have no body cavity, and so absorb oxygen and nutrients through their skin. Basic, primitive creatures, flatworms are assumed to be the oldest living ancestors of all bilateral animals, which are those that have a right and a left side, and are thought to have remained unchanged in appearance for over 500 million years. In Britain, we have about 4 native species of flatworm, although there's at least another 15 non-native species that have so far been inadvertently introduced with the importation of pot plants. But it was back in the 60s when invasive flatworms were first reported in Britain, when the New Zealand flatworm, a dark brown species that grew up to 8 inches long, was being found in our gardens. Its appearance caused great concern, since it was a rapidly reproducing flatworm and known for its voracious predation of the ecologically important earthworms. However, attempts to contain and eradicate the New Zealand flatworm failed, and so it became established and spread, mainly throughout the northern parts of Britain. Then a few years later, the Australian flatworm appeared, a smaller orange-coloured predator of earthworms, which also became established, but this time spread across mainly the southern counties of England and Wales. Despite the appearance of other invasive flatworms in Britain, the New Zealand and Australian species remain our greatest concern and continue to spread to new locations. And so it's not uncommon to find at least one of these species within our gardens, under a plant pot or in a shady, damp area amongst the borders, where they'll rapidly reproduce and remain active throughout the year. And although their impact on the native earthworm population might not be noticeable, it could be quite severe. So if we do find flatworms in our garden, the current advice is to take a photo or collect a specimen and then report it to the British Non-Native Secretariat, the details for whom can be found online. However, controlling an infestation of flatworm is not easy though, since there are no chemical products available. And for those who might have a manual method in mind, it might be worth knowing that flatworms can reproduce by fission, which means sections of their bodies can grow back into new individuals.
You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.